Wyoming Territory, January 1883, the first thing he saw was her bare hand, pale against the white snow, fingers curled around nothing. Trace Fallon reined in his horse so fast the gelding reared halfway before landing again, snorting clouds into the frozen morning air. The North Platte River ran sluggish and half-iced beside them, and the woman lay crumpled at its edge, her skirts stiff with frost, the skin of her face nearly blue. He was off his saddle before the horse had stilled. "Miss," he said sharply, kneeling beside her. No answer. He touched her cheek. Ice cold, but she was breathing. Barely, Trace yanked his saddle blanket loose and wrapped it around her, then stripped off his thick wool coat and added it over the top. He did not stop to ask questions. He lifted her carefully into his arms. She was light as driftwood and twice as cold, and carried her back to the fire he had lit earlier that morning under a low bluff for shelter. She did not stir as he settled her down near the flames. Her lips were cracked. Her boots were soaked through. Her dress looked like something out of Denver, too fine for a place like this. Nothing about her made sense. Trace leaned close and pressed the back of his hand to her neck, still breathing. He unrolled his bedroll and wrapped her in every piece of wool and canvas he had. Then he sat close, tucked his arms around her, and waited for dawn to break over the edge of the world. She woke coughing. It was nearly full morning, the sun casting long orange rays across the snow, and her eyes fluttered open like she was not sure if she should be alive. "Easy now," Trace said, his voice low. She blinked up at him, her lips moved. "Where?" she rasped. "You are safe. You were near the river. I found you half frozen." She coughed again, then tried to sit. He steadied her with a hand. Best not to move too fast. "You were near gone." She looked down at the fire, then up at him. Her eyes were light brown, almost amber in the firelight. "I remember. Water, then snow, then nothing." Trace nodded. "You are lucky I came by when I did." She stared at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" Trace Fallon. "I run cattle west of here. Was out checking fence lines. And you?" Her jaw tightened and something crossed her face, fear maybe, or grief. "My name is Vayda Orley," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Where are you from, Miss Orley?" She looked down. "I do not know any more." Trace did not press. Instead, he stood and walked to his saddlebags. He returned with a tin mug, poured in some of the coffee left in the pot, and handed it to her. She took it with both shaking hands. "Thank you. You warm enough?" he asked. She nodded. They fell quiet. The fire popped softly. After a while, she sipped the coffee and said, "My wagon was robbed. I was heading west with my brother. We were going to start a new life near Sheridan. We had a letter of work from a rancher there." Trace sat down across from her. "And where is your brother now?" "I do not know," she said, her voice cracking. "They took everything, our horse, our money. He told me to run while he fought them, and I did. I ran and kept running. I thought the river would hide me." Trace's jaw clenched. "You do not know if he made it." She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. He pulled a blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I will go look," he said. Her eyes met his, wide and uncertain. "Why would you do that?" "Because you are alone out here and no one deserves that." He stood again, poured her some more coffee, and said, "I will bring you to my cabin. It is not far. You need warmth and food. We can ride." "I can walk," she said quickly. "You are not walking anywhere." "You need time. I have a horse." She hesitated, but then nodded. The ride was slow. Vayda rode in front of him, wrapped in his coat, her head leaning against his chest as the horse picked its way through the snowy terrain. Trace kept one arm around her, steadying her. She was still too pale, and he could feel the chill in her skin even under all the layers. By the time they reached his small cabin tucked between the pines near a creek, she was asleep against him. He carried her inside, laid her gently on his bed, and stoked the fire high. Then he set a pot of stew on the stove and went out to care for the horse. Hours passed. She woke again near twilight, warm and blinking in the firelight. Trace handed her a bowl of stew. "This is too much," she said as she took it, her voice small. "You have already done so much." He sat beside the fire, eyes steady on hers. "I am not about to let someone freeze to death in front of me. That is not who I am." Her eyes filled again, but she blinked fast and looked away. They ate in silence. Later that night, as the wind howled outside and snow began again to fall, Trace set an extra quilt over her shoulders. She sat near the fire, watching the orange flames flicker. "You are kind," she said softly. He looked over at her. "Kind is just doing what is right. No. A lot of men would have left me there. I am not a lot of men." She gave him a small smile, the first he had seen from her. "I can tell." She slept in the bed and he took the floor. The cabin was quiet except for the wind and the steady breath of the woman he had found near dead by the river. In the morning, she stood in the doorway, watching the pale sun rise over the snow-covered hills. He came up behind her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders again. She turned to look at him. "What now?" "We take it one day at a time," he said. "You can stay here till you decide what you want to do." Her eyes searched his face. "And if I do not want to leave," Trace's chest tightened, "then you stay." She nodded once, slow and sure. And when their eyes met again, something passed between them, quiet, deep, and full of something that felt like the start of a new life. The shovel rang against frozen earth as Trace dug, steam rising from his back in the cold morning light. The tracks had led him through a narrow defile east of the ridge, where shriveled scrub oak clung to life and the wind funneled sharp as a knife. He found what was left of the wagon there burned to the wheels, half buried in snowdrift. One body slumped behind a charred wheel, young, dark-haired. A bullet hole clean through the chest. He stood over it for a long while. When the grave was dug deep enough, he knelt down and pulled the man gently from the wreckage. His features were stiff, but not yet gone to rot. There was a resemblance, same nose, same dark brow. Trace laid the body in the grave with care. Then he stood, filled in the earth, and smoothed the snow back over top. He found a rusted horseshoe in the wreckage. He brought it back with him. Back at the cabin, Vayda was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a pile of dried herbs he hadn't known were tucked into his kitchen shelf. She didn't look up when he stepped in, boots heavy from the ride. "I used to help my mother with these," she said, fingers moving with practiced ease. She was a midwife in Missouri, knew every root that could cool a fever or settle a stomach. Trace set the horseshoe quietly on the mantel. "You still remember what's what?" "Yes," she said, then looked up at him. "I remember that." He nodded once, then pulled off his gloves. "You'll need to show me sometime." She watched him a long moment. "You found him?" "I did." Her shoulders straightened, but she didn't ask how. Instead, she gathered the herbs into a small cloth pouch and stood. "He was the only family I had left." Trace stepped aside as she walked to the hearth and crouched beside it. She added a few of the twigs to the fire, the scent of sage rising with the smoke. "I buried him proper," he said. "Thank you." They stood in silence, the fire between them. The wind blew against the cabin walls, soft and steady. Later, he brought in another load of wood from the stack out back. When he came in, she was holding a small book, its spine cracked, pages thin and yellowed. "Your Bible?" she asked, voice quiet. "It was my mother's." She turned it gently in her hands, then set it back on the shelf. She must have been strong. She was. Vayda looked out the window, where the snow had started again, slow, deliberate flakes drifting across the hills. "I used to think I had to keep moving, keep running. That standing still meant getting caught." Trace leaned against the doorframe. "And now," she didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Now I wonder if stillness might be the only way to heal." He crossed to the stove, poured water into the kettle, and set it over the flame. "I've got a second chair," he said after a moment. "Could use the company." She gave him a look that lingered, then nodded once. They sat together that evening, not speaking much. She mended a tear in her sleeve with a needle she'd found in his sewing tin. He whittled a bit of pine into the beginnings of a spoon. The fire burned low and steady, casting long shadows across the floor. When she rose to bank the fire for the night, she paused beside him. "Would it be all right if I stayed through the thaw?" she asked. "I'd like that." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and lightly touched his sleeve. "I think I'd like that too." He watched her as she turned toward the bed, her step steadier than it had been. He didn't say it aloud, but something deep inside him shifted, something quiet and certain, like a root finding soil after too long lost to the wind. The snow began to melt by the second week of March, slow rivulets running down from the higher ridges and pooling under the eaves of the cabin. The pine trees wept in the afternoons, their branches heavy with thaw. Trace patched the roof where the ice had worked loose shingles, and Vayda hung washed linens in the sun, her fingers pink from cold water and lye soap. They moved around each other with a rhythm that had grown steady. One morning she stood by the creek, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair braided back in a thick twist. Trace had gone down to cut more willow for fence stakes, but turned when he heard her call. "There's trout in here," she said, pointing to a dark slip beneath the surface. He stepped beside her, squinting into the current. "You've fished before, with snare line and patience." She glanced at him. "I could show you," he raised a brow. "I've only ever used a rod, no need for that." "Not if you know where to set the line." That afternoon, she showed him how to wedge a length of string between two rocks just above a calm bend. She baited the hook with a bit of salted pork, then stepped back, brushing her hands on her skirt. "It takes time," she said. "But it works." He watched her as she spoke, the way her eyes flicked toward the water, the ease in her movements. It struck him how little fear she carried now, how much steadier her voice had become. "Did your mother teach you that?" he asked. "No, my brother." Her smile was faint. "We used to skip meals some weeks. He figured out fast that creeks fed better than promises." Trace nodded once, not pressing. That evening they ate trout roasted over cedar branches. The meat flaked apart with a clean, wood-smoke taste. She reached for a second piece, and he handed it to her without a word. After supper, she lingered by the window. The light outside had turned gold, the sky streaked with soft orange. A few elk moved through the far trees, their silhouettes slow and sure against the last of the snow. "Did you build this cabin yourself?" she asked. "With my father. Years ago, is he nearby?" "No, buried in Casper." She turned, leaning one shoulder against the wall. "You've been alone a long time." Trace didn't answer right away. He stood and banked the fire, then came to stand beside her. "It's easier sometimes, not having to explain yourself." She looked up at him. "But it's not what you want." He met her gaze and held it. "No," he said quietly, "not anymore." She didn't look away, her voice was steady. "Then don't be." The wind pressed gently against the cabin walls. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called once, low and distant. Trace reached out and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. Later, she sat near the fire, mending a tear in one of his flannel shirts. He carved another spoon beside her, his knife moving in slow, careful strokes. The quiet held them both, not heavy like it had been in those first days, but easy now, like something familiar. When the last of the light faded, she set the mended shirt aside and said, "I'd like to stay through planting. Help with the spring work if you'll have me." He looked at her hands, strong, capable, healed. "I'd be glad for it," he said. "I could use someone who knows how to catch trout," she smiled. "Then you'll have to let me bait the line," he nodded, and something settled deep in him, quiet and solid. Like soil warming under the first days of sun. By early April, the thaw had reached the high pasture, and with it came the work of mending fence lines and clearing winterfall. Trace spent most days riding the property boundaries with a coil of wire strapped behind his saddle, and Vayda followed on foot with a canvas sack slung over one shoulder, collecting sprigs of wild yarrow and bark slivers for tinctures she'd begun distilling in small glass jars on the cabin windowsill. One afternoon, he found her crouched near a wind-felled pine, gently prying moss from the bark with the edge of a bone-handled knife. "Does that serve a purpose, or are you just making the place prettier?" he asked, stepping down from his horse. She stood and brushed her palms together. "Boil it with willow, and you've got something better than whiskey for pain." He nodded once, tying his horse to a low branch. "You planning on curing the whole valley?" "I like to have something to offer," she said, then added, "It helps to earn your keep." "You already have." She looked at him a moment, then turned her gaze back to the moss in her hand. That night after supper, she laid the bundles out on a square of muslin and began labeling them in careful script with the stub of a graphite pencil. The firelight caught the slope of her cheek, and Trace, seated across the table, watched her with quiet intent. "You write like someone who used to teach," he said. She didn't glance up. "I did, for a short while, in Kansas, before the war left too many widows and too few wages." He reached for the tin of tobacco on the shelf behind him. "That would have been in your teens." "I was 15. It was a one-room schoolhouse. Most of the children were younger than I was. You miss it," her fingers paused. "I miss being useful in a way that mattered to other people." He packed his pipe in silence, then lit it from a coal off the stove. "You matter now," he said, voice low. She looked up at him, and something in her expression softened, not in surprise, but in recognition. The next morning she rose before him, her boots already laced and her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. When he stepped outside, coffee in hand, she was leading the mule toward the creek with 2 empty pails. "You're starting early," he said, sipping. "I want to beat the rush," she said over her shoulder. He laughed just once, a dry sound that startled them both. She looked back at him, eyebrows lifted. "That's the first time I've heard you make a sound like that." Trace leaned against the porch post. "Wasn't sure I remembered how." The days lengthened. The high sun brought patches of green to the edges of the pasture, and the creek ran clearer now, its banks no longer rimmed with ice. Vayda began setting up a small table outside the cabin where she sorted her herbs under the open sky. She wore her hair pinned up now, not because he asked her to, but because it stayed out of the way while she worked. One afternoon, he came back from the southern ridge with a torn sleeve and a shallow gash on his forearm where barbed wire had caught him. He dismounted outside the cabin, wincing as he pulled the fabric back. She stepped from the doorway before he could reach the porch. "Let me see," she said, already reaching for the wash basin. He sat on the bench as she cleaned the wound, her touch firm but careful. "You ought to be more mindful," she said. "Wire doesn't forgive carelessness." "I wasn't careless," he said. "The horse spooked, saw something in the brush." What kind of something? Could have been a cat. "Didn't see it clear." She nodded once, then turned back to the salve she'd left warming near the stove. "You were lucky," she said, applying it with a strip of linen. "Maybe I've been lucky for a while now." She looked up then, eyes steady on his. Neither of them spoke again until she tied off the bandage. That night he found her on the back stoop, watching the stars edge into view. He joined her, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You ever think about staying?" he asked quietly. She didn't turn. "I've thought about what it would mean to stop running. And I think I already have." Trace's hand found hers, fingers rough against her palm. She didn't pull away. The moon rose over the ridge, casting pale light across the fields, and their silence held not distance, but something whole and unspoken. It lingered between them like breath in winter air, visible, real, and warming. The last frost passed without notice. One morning the ground simply held warmth, and the creek ran clear from bank to bank. On that day, Trace turned the soil, and Vayda brought seeds out in a worn tin marked Spring 1879. The writing, faded but careful, had been her mother's, and she laid the tin in the sun to warm before opening it. She knelt beside him and pressed a kernel of corn into the earth. "She used to say every seed is a promise." He glanced over. "You believe that?" Her hands moved steadily down the row. "I think I want to." They worked until the sun dipped low. The field, once brittle and gray, now bore neat rows of dark, turned soil. When they finished, she stood and brushed her palms clean, watching the sky take on the color of old honey. That evening, she set out 2 plates without asking and folded a cloth napkin between them. As they ate, Trace leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his fork. "This land's too wide for one man." She tilted her head. "You've managed it this long." "I've kept it standing. That's not the same thing." She folded the cloth slow and precise. "What are you saying?" He looked at her across the table, his voice quiet. That I don't want to do any of it without you." For the first time, her hands stilled entirely. She searched his face, and whatever she had expected to find wasn't there, only steadiness, only truth. "I never thought I'd be offered something like that again," she said. "I'm not offering it because of what you've lost, Vayda. I'm offering it because of who you are." She stood slowly, came around the table, and laid her hand over his. "I want to stay, Trace. I want to build something with you that won't be taken." He stood with her, their hands still joined. "Then we will." The spring passed with the quiet rhythm of days claimed by honest labor. Vayda began keeping a small ledger of pantry stores and animal feed. Trace built her a narrow shelf above the hearth where she lined up her tinctures and poultices, each labeled in her own clean script. The cabin, once only his, now echoed with shared footsteps, shared breath. By June, the garden had come in strong. Beans climbed where she'd tied them with twine, and the corn stood 2 feet tall. One afternoon, Trace came back from the west fence line with a wrapped bundle under his arm, and he laid it on the table without a word. She opened it slowly. Inside was a length of blue calico, soft and fine. "I noticed you keep patching that skirt of yours," he said, shifting on his feet. "Figured you deserved better." She ran her fingers over the fabric. "I haven't had a new dress since before Kansas." "Then it's overdue." She looked up, her eyes full but steady. "You pay attention." "I always have." That night, she sewed long after the lamp's flame burned low. He watched her from the rocker, the cabin thick with the scent of pine resin and lamp oil. When she finally held the dress up to the light, he saw the shape of something lasting in it, something made with care. The next Sunday, she wore it. She stepped outside just as the sun crested the far ridge. He was splitting kindling by the shed and stopped mid-swing. "Does it fit?" he asked. She turned once, slowly. "It fits just right." He reached for her hand, calloused and warm. They walked the pasture edge together, not speaking much. The wind moved through the tall grass like a quiet blessing. Later that day, he led her to the bluff above the creek, where the stones were flat and warm. He knelt in the grass and opened a small wooden box, the corners worn smooth by years of handling. Inside was a ring, plain silver, with a single carved line around the band. "My mother gave it to me before she passed," he said, looking up. "Told me I'd know when it was time to use it." Vayda knelt beside him, her breath catching just once. "I'd like to wear it," she said. "If you'd like me to." He slipped it onto her finger, and she held his hand a long while after. They married under the pines behind the cabin, just the two of them and the world bearing quiet witness. No preacher came. Trace read the words from his mother's Bible, and Vayda answered with a vow of her own making, spoken clear and steady. They sealed it with joined hands and a kiss that carried every promise they'd planted in the earth together. That evening, as the last light faded, he held her against his chest beside the fire. Her head rested beneath his chin, one hand curled over his heart. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. Trace kissed her hair, his voice low. "You are now, you always will be." The wind moved soft through the trees outside, and the fire burned slow and steady. In that cabin, wrapped in warmth and the hush of a life hard-earned, they rested two people no longer running, no longer alone. Years later, the garden grew in wider rows, and the shelves above the hearth held new jars, new herbs. Children's boots lined the wall, small and well-worn. Laughter echoed through the trees in summer, and in winter, the cabin glowed against the snow like a lantern held out in the dark. And inside, Trace and Vayda stood side by side, older now, their hands still joined. Their love had not needed grand declarations. It had grown in quiet mornings and steady work, in shared sorrow and unspoken strength. And it endured as sure and certain as the land beneath their feet.